In Genesis 17, as part of this covenant, God changes Abraham's name from Abram to Abraham. And then, check out what happens next. And Abraham then obligates himself to God in the irrevocable act of circumcision. Once Abraham had circumcised himself, he couldn't uncircumcise himself. So God's irrevocable mark was on Abraham. Now check this out. And in this cutting away of the flesh, listen, in this spiritual act of surrender, this act of sanctification, setting ourselves apart for God, there is an everlasting mark put on Abraham by God. A mark that clearly stated that he belonged to God. Now here's what's so cool about this covenant relationship. In a covenant relationship, there is an exchange. There is divine promise and human obligation. There is the sovereignty of God and the free will of man. But at the very heart of covenant, at the very heart of this whole thing, there is a relationship that is bound together and it is meant to last. Daniel and his 3 friends understood this. Abraham was the father of Judaism, and so they understood this covenant relationship. And they were learned Hebrew boys. But beyond this, they knew God by personal experience of his presence, and they acted like it. And their faith and confidence in God led them to an unbreakable obedience to God right in the middle of their suffering. And do you know what it produced? Men of unbreakable character and men of unbreakable conviction. If you want to hear more about covenant, read in Genesis. Awesome, awesome stuff. So let's hear more about their story. Daniel and his 3 friends live by their God convictions, and for a while, everything goes well for them. But in chapter 3, everything changes because Daniel's 3 friends enter a season of suffering, and here's what happened. King Nebuchadnezzar comes up with this great plan to build a gold statue 90 feet high, and he makes a proclamation throughout the land that every time the band plays Hail to the Chief, everyone has to fall on their knees and worship this statue. And if you don't fall on your knees and worship this statue, your punishment is you will be thrown into a furnace of fire. Well, guess who doesn't bow down? Guess who won't compromise? Any guesses? The 3 good Jewish boys, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Now, we don't know where Daniel was during this story, but for some reason he's not mentioned. But Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are attending this gross display of the king's idolatry, and then when the music begins to play, everyone at this event falls on their faces and worships the golden statue except for these 3 men. And when word got back to the king, he was furious, and he ordered that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego be brought to him. And when they were brought before the king, listen to what he said to them. Is it true that you don't respect this God that I've made? If it is, I'm giving you a second chance to compromise. But from now on, when the music plays, you've got to get on your knees and worship this statue that I've made. And if you don't, I'll have you thrown into a furnace of fire. So here are Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And once again, God is asking them to live out unbreakable obedience in the midst of suffering. Really, in the face of death. These guys only have 2 choices. They have to choose whether they are going to obey God and live out a life of conviction, or whether they're going to disobey God and choose a life of compromise. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? Listen to what they do, because this is awesome. In Daniel 3:16, it says, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered King Nebuchadnezzar, your threat means nothing to us. There's no way that we're going to compromise. If you throw us in the fire, the God that we have a covenant relationship with, the God we serve can rescue us from your roaring furnace and anything else you might cook up, O king. But even if he doesn't choose to rescue us, it wouldn't make a bit of difference, O king. We still wouldn't serve your gods or worship the gold statue you set up. Because we are choosing to live lives of unbreakable obedience to God right here, right now, in the midst of our suffering, and even in the face of death. Because we are determined, O king, to be men of unbreakable character and conviction, and we are determined to honor our covenant relationship with the one true God, the God of heaven. Well, this doesn't go over very well with the king, and he orders that they be thrown into the furnace of fire. And the fire was so hot that it killed the men who threw them in. But check this out. The furnace wasn't hot for Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. In fact, it was kind of a cool experience for them. Because when God saw what was happening to his boys, he got right in the fire with them. Listen, church, the reason that we are refined through the fire of suffering is because we find God in the fire of our suffering. The reason that Job was refined by fire and Joseph was refined by fire and these three Hebrew boys were refined by fire. The reason today, in the 21st century, we are still refined by fire is that the fire of suffering is where we find God. Right smack dab in the middle of the fire of our suffering, that's where we come to know God. Can I just say this to you? If you are in a season of suffering right now, if you are struggling to suffer without compromise right now, you need to know this, my friend. There is someone in the fire with you. There is someone in the fire with you. And he can help you suffer without compromise, just like he helped these Hebrew boys suffer without compromise. The covenant-keeping God is with us in and through every season of suffering in our life. But check this out. That doesn't mean that we are going to be rescued from every season of suffering. Because even though Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego believed that God could save them from anything, listen, their obedience to God wasn't contingent upon their rescue. I'm going to say that again because it just came up on the screen. Is it back here? Even though Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego believed that God could save them from anything, their obedience to God wasn't contingent upon their rescue. In other words, they weren't like, well, we know for sure that God is going to rescue us, so therefore we'll go ahead and obey him. No, their obedience to God had nothing to do with his rescue of them, but his relationship with them. Did you get that? Their obedience to God had nothing to do with his rescue of them, but his relationship with them. What a great story, and how applicable that is for our lives today. Well, Daniel continues to live in the palace and experience the favor of the king because he interprets the king's dreams, and the king can see that God's blessing and favor are on Daniel. And Daniel serves Nebuchadnezzar throughout his rule, and then another king comes along named Belteshazzar, I think some people say, and he serves him through his rule. And then during the reign of a king named Darius, I'm going to call him Darius, Daniel enters a season of suffering, and here's how it happened. This story is found in chapter 6. King Darius really liked Daniel, and he noticed his gifts right away, and immediately he put him in charge of his whole kingdom. Of course, this made some people mad, and so they got together and they said, hey, I don't think we're going to be able to dig up any dirt on Daniel because, you know, he's just this guy of unbreakable character and an unbreakable obedience to God, so we're going to have to come up with some bogus religious plan to destroy him.